Good morning on this Wednesday. I am Brendan Kinney with UpNorthLive News. Thanks so much for tuning in here with UpNorthLive, Facebook, YouTube, and X. It is November. It's time for your mental health connection, joined by Kendall and Daryl. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Morning.
And so we'll start, ladies first, with Kendall. If you can introduce yourself and what you do there with Northern Lakes Community Mental Health.
Yeah, so my name is Kendall Sidnam. I am an operations manager for two programs within Northern Lakes CMH. So I manage the ACT team, the Assertive Community Treatment team in 3 counties, and I also manage the Behavioral Health Home Chat team.
Good morning to you, Kendall. Thanks again. Daryl, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday.
Thank you for having me. I'm Daryl Washington, and I am the Chief Strategic Officer for Northern Lakes Community Mental Health. And generally, what I do is to ensure that the services that we deliver are of the best quality, better understanding what the community needs are, and integrating that in the services that we deliver.
Thank you, Daryl, and nice to meet you. And we're talking about stigma this morning, but before we get into that, in case somebody's never heard of Northern Lakes Community Mental Health, who wants to talk about what you do, where the offices are located, how people get in contact with you?
Yeah, so I can do that. So Northern Lakes Community Mental Health is, we have 4 office locations in Traverse City, Michigan, Cadillac, Grayling, and Houghton Lake. Our website is northernlakescmh.org. And our phone number is 231-922-4850. So we primarily service, people with different mental health needs, whether that be therapy, psychiatric services, anything like that throughout all the counties in our area. And it is primarily for people that maybe have a hard time finding these services in different areas, whether that's because due to insurance reasons, access, anything like that.
Good deal. Thank you, Kendall. And Daryl, was there anything else you wanted to add on to that?
No, I think she covered it well.
Wonderful. We'll get right into it. Talking about stigma, what is it? Are there different kinds? Kendall, if you can start the conversation, please.
Yeah, so stigma, it's a very broad subject, right? But in its broadest sense, it's basically a negative belief that is associated with a specific trait, identity, behavior, community group, anything like that. So there's lots of different types of stigma, but for today, I'm just going to talk about like the main 3. So the first one, that's the biggest one I would say, is that public societal stigma. So that's like the learned beliefs that we just grow up learning in society or are taught to us generationally. And so using kind of an example related to mental health, I'm sure that everyone has heard the belief, that maybe someone with a specific mental illness may be dangerous or incapable in certain senses, right? And so that is a negative stigma. So that's a stigma. It's a massive generalization that because someone has this specific diagnosis, it means they're dangerous. Right, which then casts a negative light on that diagnosis, on symptoms of that diagnosis, and in turn, people that have that diagnosis, even if somebody has never, been dangerous and are not dangerous. So that's kind of that public side of it. The other side of stigma is that self-stigma. So that's when those beliefs actually become internalized. And so if someone, say, gets diagnosed with this diagnosis we're talking about, and they've never been dangerous, they aren't dangerous, but now all of a sudden they believe they are because they, have been labeled with this term that society deems, negative. And so then you have an internalized, negative sense of self based on this stigma. And then the third, I would say, is that perceived stigma, which is kind of similar to self-stigma, but we talk a lot about it in mental health in the mental health field and as mental health providers, because it's the belief that someone is judging you, because of a stigma in place. And so, I have this mental health diagnosis that the public deems dangerous. So now I think I'm dangerous. I may be nervous or anxious to share with my doctors or mental health providers that I have this diagnosis now, right? Because I'm fearing that they'll judge me or think that I'm a certain way because of it. And, that's not helpful for anybody in the profession. We're here to help, and we have to know these diagnoses. And so making sure that we're not putting any judgment on any diagnoses or any beliefs, right? That's just one example. And we can, turn that into talking about identities, talking about behaviors, anything like that. But that's pretty much what stigma is. It's that negative belief associated.
And Kendall, why is it important to address stigma?
Yeah, I mean, by definition, stigma is negative, right? And so it's a negative assumption, it's a negative generalization, and that's not ever helping anybody to make mass generalizations in a negative light. So one of the easiest ways I would think to address it is using language. And I know that, we're going to talk about that today, and how we speak in the language that we use is really impacts stigma and is a huge driver of that.
And then why is language important in addressing stigma? I know we kind of talked on these things, but if there's anything else you want to mention.
Yeah, I would say it's so language is vital in creating stigma, right? So in the simplest way, I think would be in just labeling traits as good or bad. As children, we're taught how to label things as good or bad, and that in turn creates, these two groups of things, which things are not just black and white, right? Things can be good and bad at the same time. And so using that example of that mental health diagnosis we were talking about, when you're labeling it as dangerous or bad, it's using negative language and then putting it in that negative group, right? Which then just furthers that stigma that, this diagnosis, mental health symptoms, whatever it may be, an identity group is in turn bad. Right. And that just furthers that belief, furthers that stigma. So keeping mindful of your language and how we're labeling things is really important. Because in the opposite, right, if we were using positive words, then it would put that in that positive group, labeling it as something positive. People would have a positive association with it.
Thank you, Kendall. Daryl, go to you and ask, what are the origins of stigma?
The origins of stigma are generally the way that we learn in a society at large. It's no one, certainly in learning about stigma and knowing how it negatively affects another, we certainly wouldn't want to continue to promote it, but it's learned behavior. It's really a misunderstanding for lack of knowledge that we need in order to appropriately engage with someone or to prevent stigma from occurring. Historically, for example, I'm trying to think, COVID was a good example of a lot of misunderstanding about what you've learned or hear in maybe the media, or what you hear, symptoms that people have and all of that. But I think what was a really good example historically of how stigma is promoted is with AIDS. At first, it was all people knew about it, and all was reported were about the deaths, and a particular group of in the population where it was occurring. So that group were labeled as bad people or negative thing, or they were stigmatized because we just didn't know a lot initially about AIDS. And it just sort of perpetuated itself because with AIDS, it took I think a lot longer to get some general understanding about how you could be safe. And generally, we don't bias people intentionally. It is in some ways a natural method for us to cope with something that we perceive as potentially dangerous to ourselves. So it's sort of a way that we shield ourselves, but it negatively impacts others. But it's really a lot of misconception and misunderstanding, and the onus is on us to provide and offer people a complete understanding. And at the point at which we're able to do that, we won't really see a lot of bias, specifically as it pertains to mental health. There's a lot of unknowns. Diagnoses are very complex. Why people behave in ways that would otherwise seem erratic or, as Kendall mentioned, dangerous. But the truth is, statistically, those with mental health are not, by and large, dangerous. It just may appear so because you hear about um, events where something more serious has occurred or has happened, and this person just so happens to maybe have a mental health issue. But it's really a way for us to naturally guard and protect ourselves.
Thank you for that, Daryl. And I wanted to acknowledge we have people watching here. We have Mark watching from Fremont, Indiana, and Susan Radke saying thank you for addressing this topic. So thank you, Mark and Susan, for watching and commenting. And Daryl, next question would be, how do we get stigmatized?
Again, it goes to how we learn. It's a part of our developmental process. In so many ways, we mature in life. We have developmental processes that we go through, and they sort of intertwine with even things such as learning bias and becoming or stigmatizing another. Um, for example, there's a phenomenon that is psychologists discovered years ago. It's called proximity effect. It's where when you're living in a community or living with it, even in the family, your community, your family, the circle that you're in, that's where you develop. That's where you learn for by and large. And whatever that community believes, because you're close to them, it is going to affect who you are and what you believe until you get outside of your circle and engage with others and others who may have more information on a particular topic. Again, we're talking about mental health. We have to get beyond that. Other things that occur are another psychological phenomenon or developmental phenomenon is motivated reasoning, or basically it's our cognitive process where we selectively interpret information in ways that supports our existing beliefs. Again, we're self-protecting to some extent. And it when that's happening, I think the best example of that is maybe this past election. Um, a lot of times people are voting based on reasons that support their existing beliefs. But when it goes to how we really should think about maybe voting is what will positively impact the nation at large, not what will positively impact me. And it's that motivated reasoning that sort of gets in the way of us being able to engage others, um, those with mental health issues, in a way that is best for them and allows them to ultimately access services. There's really a lot. There's being a part of the in group and the out group. The in group is everyone who has positive attributes. The out group is everyone who has negative attributes. And again, self-protecting, we don't want to be associated or affiliated with those that are considered or perceived as less desirable as it reflects on us.
Thank you, Daryl. We'll go to Kendall for the next question here. How does somebody know if they're acting in a stigmatizing way?
Yeah, it can be really, really difficult to catch yourself and to learn and to change these things. And I really want to bounce off what Daryl said is like, it's really important to know first off that like exactly stigma is learned and it's passed down, and it's, you know, through society, through families, especially within the groups that you live in and are closest in. And so a lot of times, like, people may be acting in a stigmatizing way, but it's not conscious, or they don't notice they're doing it. It's not purposeful, right? It's just what they're used to and what they've been taught. And so it can be really hard to change because, you know, maybe you've been doing this your whole life and you don't realize that it's maybe hurting someone. And so one of the best ways, I think, to kind of notice if you're acting in a stigmatizing way is just looking at your language again. So when you're speaking about a topic, whether it's an identity, a community group, whatever it is, you know, be mindful of, like, am I using positive language? Am I using negative language? You know, how am I describing this? You know, because when you're using that descriptive language to focus on it, if you notice that it's, you know, mainly negative language, whatever that may be, bad, dangerous, incapable, whatever, it's likely stigmatizing. Right. And so if you notice that you're using really positive language, it's likely not. And it's just about that labeling, you know, and that in and out group, like Daryl mentioned. And so once you're able to, you know, get to that step that you can reflect and listen to how you're describing groups of people or individual people, the next step is possibly the hardest, is just being open to changing that. Right, which is harder than it may sound. And so whether that's having conversations with friends and family about, you know, saying like, hey, I'm learning about stigma, I'm trying to change some of my behaviors and how I talk about things. What do you think? You know, have you noticed that I say anything? Because it's possible, you know, someone that you maybe love is feeling hurt by a word that you're saying or how you're describing something, and they haven't brought it up to you. Right. And so just being very open to having conversations like this, being willing to change, and just reflecting, right? Because the only way that we can change societal public stigma is starting at that societal level of people understanding, you know, and being wanting to do this.
So, Daryl, what kind of actions can a person take to address stigma their loved one may be experiencing?
Mhm. I think overall, to address, for the past year, I've been doing a lot of research and work in how we can address or prevent stigma, and it's like a lot of what Kendall just spoke about, but it's all about your intentionality. Um, it is not common sense to be culturally competent in how you engage. You have to be very intentional. And I don't know what the epiphany needs to happen with an individual to really motivate them to want to make that change in their own life. But that's what it will take for us to um, instead of some of the misconceptions, it is engaging, having a desire to want to learn to do better. One of the things that I've really been examining is it's be a little beyond just cultural competence, because cultural competence in so many ways, it's just learning about how to engage. But when we've done that in the past year. We've done a lot of work, especially in the helping professions, around implicit bias and making sure that people have been trained and understand that. But it has to be way more than just checking the box. You can't just have the information. You have to do something with the information. So it again, we develop throughout life. We also need to, along with developing emotional intelligence, we need to develop cultural intelligence, which is really a fourfold model in how we develop our cultural intelligence. We take action, or cultural intelligence drive is what they call it. We take steps to want to desire to. That's where you have to begin, is to have the intention and the desire. From that is where you lean into learning more knowledge about in this case, mental health issues, how you can help, all of that. So, and gaining knowledge, that would be the next step. But then the step beyond that is what Kendall alluded to. It is developing empathy and perspectives taking it, and that's a process that takes effort in a while. It means sitting down, actually reflecting on the information that you've newly learned about how to engage. Well, when you have that, then you really effectively have a strategy for what I can do differently. And after that, then we move on to really taking the action. I've learned, I've reflected. Now I'm going to take steps. I'm going to take action. What might that action be? It might be just, if I have a loved one, it is just learning everything I can about their particular mental issue. If I want to broaden my scope and affect more of a change, I might become an advocacy for policy development. I might go speak to my representative and ensure that the services that are necessary for just not my loved ones, but others who have this, that they're actively doing something about it. So we'll have services available and they're there. We also, at, I think, as a society at large, is we have to promote cultural humility, especially around the whole mental health in general. And basically, what I mean by that is really thinking more about the people that we live with and engage with every day, above and beyond just ourselves, but putting others first. Going back to my example about voting, let's do it with cultural humility, putting others' needs above and before our own. I think that's how we'll really be able to eradicate um, stigma, bias in general.
If I can just jump onto the end of that, Daryl, I completely agree. And I think, like, on a very smaller level, if you notice a loved one, maybe, you know, that has an identity that's, like, typically stigmatized, you can, and maybe, someone says something and about them being incapable for whatever reason, right? Do what you can to make them feel capable, right? It's even that small step of, like, hey, I heard this person say this thing. Do you want to talk about it? Are you okay? I believe in you. I know you can do this. I know you're not bad. You know you're not bad, right? Building up that confidence and using, the power of, like, your language to kind of counteract that negative. It's not going to fix everything. Like Daryl said, there's a lot more built into this, but just in that individual, in that moment, you have some power to help your loved one through that.
Thank you, Kendall and Daryl, for your insight. I appreciate that. So, Daryl, I'm hearing that there's a project that's beginning at Northern Lakes. It's looking at stigma from clinicians and therapists. Can you tell us about that project, please?
Yes, it goes back to one of the final things I said about developing cultural intelligence. This is a strategy. We are engaging in a strategy to ensure that the services that we deliver are stigma free and bias free. And we want to make sure that's the case with the individuals who are actually the clinicians who are actually delivering the service. So we launched a research initiative where we're going to track that and provide training and then follow up to see if the training and the supports that we're providing actually makes a change. It was very jarring to me to recently learn. I was reading an article by the American Psychological Association, and it mentioned, it was critical to address this because there were so many um, people who are actually in the business of helping who were actually presenting as a barrier to mental health because they were not culturally competent in how they were engaging with the people that they were serving. That was very alarming to me. And we at Northern Lakes are going to do whatever is necessary to ensure we're never going to be a problem for people who are seeking solutions.
Daryl and Kendall, I appreciate your time. Was there anything you wanted to mention before you wrap up? And then also to remind people how they can get a hold of you and those at Northern Lakes.
Yeah, I can say, anyone is always welcome to call, whether it's just for more information or whether it's, maybe to schedule an appointment to learn about anything. Again, our main number is 231-922-4850. And then our website, which lists all of our services, more ways to contact us, more resources, is northernlakescmh.org.
And Daryl, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. One of the other initiatives that Northern Lakes is looking forward to is this strategic officer. One of our strategies for the future is we want to provide more opportunities for our community, such as what we're doing today, training specific on specific mental health needs, issues, etc. So in the future, we look forward to providing more of a resource to our community.
Daryl and Kendall, thank you for your time. Thanks to our friends watching on the UpNorthLive Facebook, YouTube, and X pages. And we will be back next month with more from those at Northern Lakes Community Mental Health. Thanks again for your time on this Wednesday.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Bye.